Are we ready there, Tyler? Yes, we're ready. All right. Very good. Well, welcome everyone to our session that focuses on a story, a remarkable story of two Holocaust survivors. So this morning we have been talking about the plight of refugees and how difficult it is to leave your native land and the trials and tribulations of escaping from persecution. And it's certainly very much a part of the world we live in today, unfortunately. We heard the example of the Yazidi genocide this morning and the plight of Yazidi refugees. And what we're seeing now is very much an echo of what happened during the 1930s and 40s in Europe, when people being persecuted by the Nazis had to flee for their lives. And if they were lucky, they managed to survive. And fortunately for our speaker today, his parents were the lucky ones. They were able to survive and eventually come to the United States. So these are issues that continue to concern us. They're issues of both the past and the present. And it's important to hear these stories of what people experienced during the time of the Holocaust. So there was a group yesterday where we were talking about getting testimony from survivors themselves versus testimony from their children, and even in some cases grandchildren now. And what we've been doing here at Seton Hill at our Center for Holocaust Education is recording the testimonies of Pittsburgh-area Holocaust survivors. So there aren't many left, as you can imagine. They're an aging population, and many have passed away. Not all are able to tell their stories, but we've managed to record eight testimonies of Holocaust survivors. And we have created films that are appropriate for use in schools. That's our goal, is to make educational films. And so we did that, and then we couldn't find any other survivors to interview and to focus on in our video series. So we then began to get the testimonies of the children of survivors. And the first testimony we recorded is from Daniel Stern, who tells the story of his parents' harrowing escape from the Nazis and literally went around the world to try to escape Nazi persecution. And again, fortunately, we're able to do that. So I want to start out today by showing you the video that we've created that tells their story, and then I'll invite Mr. Stern, I'll invite Daniel to come up and elaborate a little bit about what's in the film and to answer your questions. All right, so let's begin.
My name is Daniel Stern. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and this is a story of the harrowing escape of my two parents from Nazi-controlled Europe. My mother's name is Frieda Meyer, and she lived in Essen, Germany, and my father's name is Edward Stern, and he comes from Budapest, Hungary. My mother was the part of a family with 6 brothers and sisters, 2 parents, and unfortunately Her two parents were sent off to Auschwitz, and her four sisters were sent to Treblinka. These are two of the Holocaust victims of Hitler's maniacal pursuit of all things Jewish in Germany and then later on in all of Europe. My mom was the first and last of her family to attend university. She went to the University of Heidelberg, and in her second year of her pre-med program, the notorious brown shirts that Hitler had gathered around him broke into the university, broke into her classroom, took her by the hair, threw her out of the classroom, and then kept throwing her into the gate outside. No German student came to her aid. And I later found out as a teenager that she would suffer depression for most of her life, although as a teenager you don't really understand these things. So she ran home, and in tears she told her parents what happened, and they commiserated, of course. She said, "I have to leave here. I cannot stay in Germany, and you must come with me." But the reality, of course, was that the borders were already being closed by Hitler. It was very difficult to leave. My mother made arrangements. She was lucky. They knew a German physician who had 3 kids. He was a widower, he was wealthy, and he needed help with his children. And so he bribed a number of German functionaries and got travel papers for my mom, his kids, and himself. They went to Portugal. Why Portugal? Because Portugal and Switzerland were the only 2 countries in Europe that were neutral. So my mother, after leaving the doctor, got a job in the British embassy. Basically, her job was to attend embassy functions. She was very attractive, and she became a very popular figure with the Nazis, with their parties, and her job was to get as much information that she could for them. They would drink a lot and speak openly. And she would relay all that information back to the British, and she was helpful in the war effort. My father is a much different story. He came from a relatively wealthy family. He was born in 1913 also in Budapest, and he was privileged. His father owned a major tannery in Hungary. And my father basically learned about the tannery business in his youth from his father, and this would become his business for the rest of his life. He went to private schools, was highly educated, ended up at the University of Budapest, which admitted precious few Jews at the time, and he ended up with a doctorate in economics. The tragedy of my father is that had he been able to stay in Hungary, his future would have been unlimited. Instead, in 1939, he was reading about what the Germans were doing in Germany to Jews, and he felt that Hitler was prone to go to war, and Hungary is right next to Germany, not far. And so he said, "I'm out of here." Now, he was an only child. He also told his parents to leave, but his parents said, "Look, we have Christian friends, they'll protect us." And sure enough, they did survive. His parents survived the war. So my father got on a train, and first he went to France because he read about the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line is a series of fortresses that the French built on their eastern frontier to stop the Germans from coming. And they felt that, well, we'll be safe. The Germans cannot penetrate that. Well, of course, we now know today that they penetrated it in 6 weeks. And in 6 weeks, not only did France fall, but most of Europe. Luckily, my father did not stay in France. He felt very nervous about the Maginot Line, and he decided also to go to Portugal, again, because it was neutral. And he also gets a job in the British Embassy. And his job was to translate cables that came in from all over Europe and from the United States as well. My father was fluent in multiple languages. And one day at an embassy party, he meets my mother. And lo and behold, they fell in love, had a brief affair, and 4 months later, they were married in Portugal. They stayed a few more months with the British, but they asked the British to provide them with papers because they had no papers. And the next place they were able to get papers to was to go to Mozambique, Africa. Why Mozambique, Africa? Because Mozambique was a colony of Portugal. And why Africa? Because they felt that Africa would be the furthest place away from Europe, and Europe was falling apart. It took my parents on a merchant ship 40 days and 40 nights to reach the port of Mozambique. Mozambique is 5,100 nautical miles away from Portugal, and the reason that was such a harrowing and dangerous trip is because the U-2 boats of Germany were now controlling the Atlantic, and it had become basically a German lake. We have records that show that 2,800 ships were sunk in the Atlantic between 1940 and 1945, which is when my parents took that trip. And 30,000 sailors and civilians perished during that time, just in the Atlantic. My parents went to Mozambique, stayed there about 2-3 months, but there was really nothing for them in Mozambique. Their next stop was to go to South Africa. Why South Africa? Because Herbert, her brother, had immigrated some 5 years prior, and my parents decided to stay in South Africa. South Africa had a horrible political system called apartheid, the complete separation of blacks and coloreds from whites. Blacks and coloreds were not allowed to live in cities like Johannesburg. They had to move away, and one of the largest ghettos next to Johannesburg is famous. It's called Soweto. And my parents, frankly, were appalled by that kind of political system. My mother said, "This is Nazi Germany. This is basically an authoritarian government. I cannot condone it." And my father agreed, "We're out of here." And their next stop would be Palestine. Now, why Palestine? 2 reasons. Palestine had become a mecca for Holocaust victims from all over the world. And the second reason was that my mother's sister, Esther, was there. They took a boat and landed in the port of Tel Aviv, where the British were in charge. This was the Palestinian Mandate. The British were extremely anti-Semitic, especially their State Department. My parents were rejected from coming into Palestine and were sent to Cyprus, where most Jewish people that try to get in were sent. And Cyprus had a camp, much akin to a concentration camp. Facilities were somewhat better, but not much better. And they had to stay there 6 months. Finally, after 6 months, my parents got into Tel Aviv and joined Esther. And yours truly was born July 4th, 1945. And so I stayed in Palestine for about 2.5 years, from 1945 to about 1947. There was constant warfare going on between the British, the Jews, and the Arabs. And there was a lot of instability. And so here my parents are in Palestine, and once again, war is coming, and they said, "We're not staying here," and now I'm part of their brood. So here we go with our 1 suitcase each. So what's next after Palestine? Well, my father had not seen his parents for 6 years. He found out that they had made it. He found out that they were alive. And so we go to Hungary. And we stayed in Hungary for about a year. It's the only time that I ever met my grandparents on my father's side, and it would be the last time. What's in Hungary for my parents? Well, my mother doesn't speak a word of Hungarian, that's number one. Number two, my father wanted to see if the tannery was still there. The tannery had been completely bombed, as was much of Budapest. And so my mother said, we can't stay here. And so the next logical place was for my father to go back to France. Why France? Because France was relatively open borders, number one. Number two, they have a substantial tannery business in France. He knew that, and he knew he could get a job. And again, this is the tragedy of my father. Here's this great intellectual with all his diplomas, and he has to go work for minimum wage in a tannery. This is a very sad story. We moved to a very humble apartment building. I still remember the address, 44 Boulevard Anatole France. The only good thing about Paris is that it was the only place in Europe, relatively, that had not been bombed. Even though Hitler had ordered his generals to burn it, they disobeyed the order. And my parents said, where's the opportunity? And the opportunity is in the United States of America. That was their final Mecca. And I have to thank them because that final move was for me. They thought that I would have much more opportunity. They wanted to so-called chase the American dream. And so we got on a boat. Now, I have to say that it took my father 7 years of lots of bureaucratic activity, 7 years to get papers to go to America legally. So we got on a boat, a cruise ship called the Liberté. And my first recollection of America is my father and mother waking me up at about 5 in the morning and taking me up to the ship's deck. And they said, we are going to cross the Statue of Liberty, and we want you to see that. Eventually, the Statue of Liberty was right in front of us, and I saw my mother crying. She was very emotional about it. This was to be their last stop. And then as the boat approached New York, for the first time I saw skyscrapers. And so I had a big acculturation process to go through. I did not know a word of English. We moved to Brooklyn, took the subway, which is fairly new, and I have one story there. At the end of the subway was a poster, and there was a man squatting down with a mask and a glove, and I said to my father in French, qu'est-ce que c'est ça? And of course he had no idea, no clue. And luckily a passenger could hear some French and helped us out and said, this is Yogi Berra, a baseball player that plays for the New York Yankees, and I don't know what the Yankees were, baseball. And so these are all the things I had to learn. The fact that my parents survived was a bit of a miracle, and of course I would not be here had they not survived that particular trip. So this is part of their harrowing trip from place to place, from Portugal to Mozambique, Mozambique to South Africa to Palestine, Palestine to Hungary, Hungary to France, each time with one suitcase to their name, and finally their final stop in the United States of America. I was naturalized at the age of 18. Previous to that, the only document I had, state-wise, in terms of belonging to a country, was my birth certificate, which is in Hebrew.
Tells Dan's story. Well, Dan, I first of all want to thank you so much for sharing your story with us and for being kind of the guinea pig as our first child of survivors to sit down for an interview with us and to allow us to make this video about your parents' journey. I think it's a valuable teaching tool for a lot of reasons. One thing is it teaches students a lot about what was going on during that period. They learn a lot about the war. You actually get a little geographical tour too. It would be good for geography classes. You learn about Mozambique and apartheid, the apartheid system in South Africa, the Maginot Line in France, which turned out not to hold at all. Your father was right about that. And you know, the trip back to Hungary, where Hungary is a very sad story because by the time the Nazis invaded Hungary, well, of course, they made their way through Europe and leaving a path of horrific destruction all along the way. And finally, they got to Hungary, and by that time, they knew they were going to lose the war, but they still did everything they could to round up the 500,000 Jewish people who lived in Hungary and send them to the death camps. So fortunately, your father escaped that horrible fate, and some members of his family did as well. So I think that's certainly one thing to learn. Another issue is, you know, we talk about the refugees making their way out of Nazi Germany or out of whatever situation of danger they're in, like the Yazidi population, for example, and then we just sort of assume, well, that's the end of the story. They came to the United States and all was well. But it was just the beginning of turmoil and struggle for many of them. First of all, you lose your home, you lose your possessions, you lose many members of your family, so you're dealing with the effects of PTSD. Then you're trying to find your way in a new country and find your footing economically. You know, there's a movie that I really like. It's been a sort of forgotten film. It stars Kirk Douglas, you know, the Hollywood actor from the 40s and 50s. It's called The Juggler, and it's about a man who goes from Europe to what was then Palestine, as your parents did, and he survives, but he's very emotionally distraught and angry and acts out in violent ways. You know, PTSD is not a small thing. It's a real thing that people deal with. And so your parents made it here. You came as a teenager, and there you are trying to learn a new language. I'll tell you, if you were as bad at languages as I am, you would have had a hard time, because that was not an easy thing to do. You're speaking French, you grow up speaking French, and suddenly, and then we both end up at the University of Pittsburgh in the sociology department there, so that's another story. But I think, you know, there's a lot to learn from this video and a lot of parallels we can make to refugees today. So Dan, please come up and say whatever you would like to say, and then let's open it up to some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Jim. It's good to see all of you, and thank you for inviting me. I want to commend the Holocaust Center for putting these videos together. It's quite amazing. This World War II is an event that happened 75 years ago, but yet it's like a lifetime for most students. Most students have begun to completely forget the events that took place there, and these videos, I think, are very helpful in bringing things back to life and reality. Jim is quite correct. My parents lost everything, and that one suitcase that you saw me as a child, that was our total possessions as we moved from country to country. It's been estimated that anywhere between 75 and 80 million people died between 1940 and 1945. 80 million. It's the largest single mass slaughter in human history, and so it deserves to be remembered. And a lot. It was a horrific time of hatred, division, and the thing to keep in perspective is that these things have happened before, and they happened in the United States. United States has had many periods in which immigrants were not welcomed. There was the whole McCarthy era. There was the Chinese Exclusionary Act. After the Chinese built the Trans-Pacific Railroad, they were all sent back to China. During the Eisenhower period, there was a period called Operation Wetback, where we sent thousands, hundreds of thousands of Mexican Americans back to Mexico. Then the Irish came during the famine, and they were hated here because the dominant religious group in America was Protestants, and these were Catholics, and they were not welcomed in the United States. And then the Italians came, and same thing. They were mostly Catholic, and they were also rejected. And of course, all these groups have eventually assimilated and become proud Americans. So, you know, these things tend to work out cyclically over time. So I would, if you have any questions of me or questions about what happened to my parents, I'd be happy to talk about it, whatever comes to mind. What Jim said about learning a new language, if you're a teenager, it's really no big deal. I can tell you that within 6 months I could understand everything. Now the thing that helped me was television. Why television? Because of ads. Commercials, new, improved, terrific, better, and these words kept coming up and up and up, and eventually that's how you connect things. So it took me about 6 months to understand most everything, and then another year or so to speak with limited accent, French accent. Which I was a little bit shy about. So linguistically, if you're a teenager, it's not that big a deal. Now, if you're in your 20s and 25, the older you get, language becomes. I'm sure the teachers of languages can attest to that. Tom, you got something?
Is it on? Yes.
Yeah.
I helped Dan with this, and we both learned a lot of history during it. But the best thing your parents ever did was move to Pennsylvania, and you're playing the piano at Easton High School, and you went from 13 not knowing a word of English to became a scholar. You won a scholarship entitling you to any university in the state of Pennsylvania, and you didn't even know where Pittsburgh was. But you chose Pitt and saw the Cathedral of Learning, and the rest is history. So,
well, thank you, Tom. And Tom did help me a lot with this presentation. It all began when I found a box of pictures that my parents had kept, old photographs, many of those that you saw up on the screen, and it was a matter of putting those together. Tom and I did a PowerPoint presentation for the Rotary Club that we both belong to, and that kind of inspired this shorter version. In the Rotary, I did two versions. One was about my parents and me coming to the States. The second is a singular, separate version, bless you, about my wife. My wife is also a product of World War II. The story there, briefly, is that her father, Bill Cochran, became a captain after graduating from Carnegie Mellon with an engineering degree. And what he did was he was drafted right away. This was 1944, and he was sent directly upon graduation to the Battle of the Bulge, which was one of the biggest battles, one of the final battles of World War II. America lost 100,000 soldiers in that battle, which did not go well initially. And then ultimately we beat the Nazis. The Russians were coming from the east, and the Americans and they met in Belgium. Long story short, my wife's mother had left Brussels and gone to a farm right in the middle of the forest there where the Battle of the Bulge took place. They thought they'd be safe there. And of course, the irony was they ended up right in the middle of one of the largest battles ever. And so that farm served as a base for my father-in-law, Bill Cochran, who won the Silver Star, by the way, in that battle. And he met Betty. They fell in love in a 3-week period. He goes back to the United States. He starts sending letters, and Betty became a war bride. She came by boat to America. They got married. Unfortunately, it didn't work out, but she did get pregnant and went back to Belgium, and Danielle lived in Belgium till she was 13 years old. And then during a summer, while I was a student at Pitt, she taught French, advanced French, to a group of French teachers, high school teachers. And I come down from the dorms, I hear all this French going on with this beautiful woman in the middle, and I hung around. I came down to get a cup of coffee because I was working on my final thesis. And I hung back, and I met Danielle, and we got to talking, and we discovered that we had all these things in common. She came at the age of 13, I came at the age of 12. She had to learn English just as I did, and long story short, an affair took place, and I married her. I was 20, she was 18, and we've been married 57 years. So we are both products of World War II. So there are some silver linings in all of this. Not many, but, and my parents, thank goodness, were kind enough to think about coming to the United States. They did it for me. They did it for me to pursue the American dream, and I very much succeeded at that. Not only was I able to teach sociology for 42 years at Ohio University, but I also started an executive search business that dealt strictly with doctors, and we placed medical doctors all over the country, especially a new specialty called emergency medicine, which basically just started to be accepted when I started my business. And so we tried to capture that particular new residency, and my firm ended up putting chairmen of emergency medicine at university centers throughout the country. So, and I ultimately was able to sell that business, and then when the people that I sold it to messed it up and wrecked it, I was able to buy it back for $1. And so I love America, I love capitalism, And I was very lucky coming out of Easton, Pennsylvania, as Tom asked about. I got a full scholarship to go to the University of Pittsburgh. My parents had no money. My father was on minimum wage the entire time until he ended up in Texas, where he became a manager of a larger tannery, and there he landed okay and started making some decent money. But while I was in high school, my father made less than $6,000 a year. So we really did not have much assets. So it was a struggle. It was not an easy path, but luckily with a full scholarship to the University of Pittsburgh, I was able to stay there. But I was always worried about running out of money. So I finished my undergraduate degree in 2 years and 8 months, because the money was running out. So, and then I became a graduate student, and there we became rich. I got $281 a month for being a graduate student, and of course they paid all the tuition, so on and so forth. So life ended up pretty good in the United States, and here I am, a proud American. I became naturalized at the age of 18, and there's an interesting story there. Recently, my wife and I brought in 2 Ukrainian refugees from the Ukrainian war. We did it through the so-called Ukrainian humanitarian act that Congress passed. And that's a lengthy bureaucratic process. Took me 6 months to fill out the paperwork. Tom was great help to me because I had to upload my IRS, I had to upload my birth certificate, upload all these documents, and you know, I'm 80 years old. I mean, what do I know about uploading IRS forms and all that? So Tom was really helpful there. But anyway, again, long story short, all of my paperwork with them was finished until I get an email from the government, our government, saying, Mr. Stern, we can't finish this process because you weren't born in this country. So I said, what do you need? And they said, we need your naturalization papers. Well, like I said, I was 18 at the time, so now I'm 80. That's very old paperwork. So I had to go find my naturalization papers, which then Tom helped me upload, and that finished up the process of bringing 2 Ukrainians to the United States. They're now living in Pittsburgh. They have their own apartment, they have jobs, and we've been very successful in bringing them in. So, and Danielle and I did that because we were both immigrants, and we thought it would be a good way for us to pay back a little bit. Yes, sir, please.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your story and for the powerful story that we've just listened to and watched. And I can make a lot of connections with some of my stories
story.
and
I bet.
stories of my community members, and we can talk days about some of that experience. But one thing that I really wanted to kind of ask you, and this is my family, my parents have been struggling with it too, is to find the true sense of belonging in the United States. And how did you, you know, obviously like you've moved around so many times in your life, you know, from different countries to different countries, and finally you settled in the United States, and you feel like you are not from here, but now you become naturalized. So can you just talk about the sense of belongingness, and how do you advise the newcomers to find that? I know it's unique, but
yeah,
that's a great from you would be perfect.
That's a great question, and I'm sorry I missed your session this morning. Jim told me it was really quite extraordinary. But to answer your question, when we first got to America, my parents went to Brooklyn. Brooklyn is a strong Jewish enclave, both Orthodox and other kinds of secular Jews and what have you. And here I am struggling with trying to learn English, and my parents put me into Hebrew school. Very, very smart. So I got my bar mitzvah. You know, you have to go through these things. And so here I am, 13. And at that time, my aunt from Israel, which you saw, my mother's sister, flew from Israel to Brooklyn to be at my bar mitzvah. And my uncle from South Africa came, and they all attended. And that's the only time that I saw my entire family in one place. I mean, you know. So the bar mitzvah was good. And then my father, shortly thereafter, got a job in Easton, PA, in a tannery, a fairly small one. So we moved to Easton. So Easton also had an active Jewish community. I joined the Jewish Community Center. And I think to answer your question, what most immigrants have to do is they have to find their community, okay? So with the Ukrainians that I brought in, there's a large Ukrainian community in Carnegie, Pennsylvania, which is a suburb of Pittsburgh. So they go there a lot to the Ukrainian Center and what have you, and that helps them. So same with me. The fact that Easton was a smaller town was actually a good thing for me, because New York can be overwhelming, really, believe me. So at the Jewish Community Center, I was also very lucky there. There was a woman that put on plays. She was she had been a Broadway actress, and she married a jeweler that lived in Easton, and she got very frustrated, and she took out her frustration by putting on plays at the Jewish Center, like, you know, all kinds of stuff. So she got me involved in that, and believe it or not, that's what got me over the French accent. She taught me how to articulate, how to go in front of audiences. I was pretty shy because of the whole business of accents and what have you. And so that was terrific for me. That was absolutely one of the best acculturation process. You know, not to speak of, I learned about Broadway, Guys and Dolls. She actually put on Guys and Dolls, which is a, you know, fairly complex. She was terrific. I fell in love with her. She was one of my first crushes, but I was 16, she was 40, so it didn't work out very well, but she was great. So, and then from there I went to Pitt, and at Pitt I was pretty much acculturated at that point, no big problem, and things went. But that's a great question. How do you get acculturated and all that? That's can be tough.
Thank you.
Talk a little bit, this takes you back, but would you talk a little bit about your mother and the fact that she was in medical school when the brown shirts came in, and then what happened to her after that?
Yeah, thank you. I wish I could say my mother was a dear soul, but she was a very tough woman. When you grow up in Germany, Germany has a great many authoritarian tendencies, and she was no exception. She was very tough on me while I was a teenager. Looking back on it now, I realize that a lot of her toughness was trying to overcompensate for her PTSD, her depression. She had periodic lows. I think she ended up being bipolar, but you know, diagnosis in those days was not so good. So she was tough, and she went through hell with most of her travels. Everything was very difficult for her, and she had to acculturate to American life just as I did. She was German. didn't speak any English. So when I was a kid, my mother would speak German to me, and I would respond in French in France. So to this day, I can pretty much 60% still understand German pretty well. If I watch a German movie on Netflix, I can get sort of 60% without the subtitles. And so what can I say? Her academic life was cut short at Heidelberg. She had the Nazis not come around, she'd be a doctor today, but that was not to be. Just like my father, I consider my father a great tragedy. He was a brilliant, really brilliant man, but could not exercise his brilliance except at home. Now, he gave that to me, luckily, and I soaked that in. So while we were in France, in Paris, my parents took me to every museum. They took me to the opera. They introduced me to oysters and good food. And so I have to say that my background is extremely European. And of course, as an adult, we've gone to Europe, I lost count, maybe 50, 60 times. We used to go to Belgium 3 times a year. So, because my wife's entire family is in Belgium. And we just came back from Belgium, by the way, a week ago. And the most surprising thing there was the weather. It was like this, sunshine in Belgium. What's going on? Must be climate change, but because usually they have the most dreadful weather in Europe. It's kind of like England. It rains every other day and it's cloudy all the time. But it was gorgeous sunshine. We went to the beach. We were bicycling on the beach. So back to your question, her life was tough, and she was pretty tough on me. I was very happy to say goodbye and go to college. Those were my best years. I loved my experience at Pitt. I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world, and so that went well.
Thank you so much for being with us today, and especially for the amazing work that you did through the video that now, it's just available for everyone and just is part of our history here at Seton Hill, and I'm so grateful for that. And I wanted to ask 2 questions. One, sure. You talked about in your adolescence, you've mentioned it a couple times, just how the trauma that especially that both your parents had gone through, just the ways that impacted you growing up. And I wondered if the stories that you portray so thoughtfully in the video, if those were things that were talked about openly in the family, or if there was a silence around that past, and then you really had to kind of ask questions and kind of try and pull to draw out your history. So that's my first question, just wondering how you learned about their experience and your own identity through that, the things that were forming you. And then secondly, I was so interested to hear about your career as a sociologist and as a professor of sociology, and so I wondered if you could comment on how that identity formation for you, how you think that impacted your work as a sociologist.
Okay, all great questions. On the first one that you asked, how did I realize all the things that went on with my parents in the past? When I found those photographs, I also found a document that my father had done, which was an oral history that he sent to the Vad Yashem Holocaust Museum in Israel. So I looked through that and I pretty much memorized it, and that gave me a wide perspective on what happened to my parents. And so that's how I got that. In terms of how the PTSD affected me, mostly through my mom. who raised me. My father was a workaholic. He was working 6 days a week from 6:30 in the morning till 7 at night, came home exhausted. So he didn't do much of my raising me. My mother raised me. And as I said, she was a tough cookie. Now, looking back on it again, maybe she straightened me out. I don't know. I was pretty rebellious guy myself. So a lot of that. Now, in terms of my second, when I graduated from the social department, I got a job right away with Ohio University. But my wife, having been raised in relative wealth in Belgium, said, we can't afford a mortgage in Fox Chapel with your lousy university education. So I had to find another way to develop income. And I looked at a lot of options, and I had taken some medical sociology courses at Pitt. There was actually a pretty good department in that, which was a new specialty. And the great thing about sociology, by the way, in case you don't have a major back there, is you can get interested in a whole slew of subjects. Sociology studies not only group dynamics, but it studies religion, it studies economics, it studies crime. I took a lot of criminology courses, and I looked into doing something there, but finally settled on what was then a fairly new career. It's called executive search, where basically you're working for clients, and the clients tend to be large organizations, either corporations or, in my case, hospitals. And so I started sending letters to CEOs of hospitals asking whether, and I knew there was a doctor shortage in the United States. There always has been, and it's worse than ever now, by the way. And here's an interesting fact for you. Here we have a horrible doctor shortage in the United States. There are over 100,000 immigrant doctors in this country right now that cannot practice because you have to go through so many hoops that it's just unbelievable. So I got letters back from those CEOs saying we would welcome help in recruiting certain physicians, and several of them told me that they needed ER physicians. That was a brand new specialty in the 70s when I started my business. and so I said to myself, gee, that makes a lot of sense. And so what I did with a few employees was go to residency programs, the few residency programs that were in emergency medicine. It was only about 7 when I started. There's over 100 now. And I picked off some of the best students, and I started putting them at Rutgers, University of Chicago, Mayo Clinic, blah, 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 and it grew from there. When I sold my company, it had 32 employees, and it had revenues of approximately $6 million a year. And I sold it for multiples of that, and as I told you, I bought it back for $1. So that part of it went pretty well. So I'm happy about that. It allows me a nice, comfortable retirement. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder if your father, in some way, his story, if it inspired your business.
No, he had. You're asking if my dad.
Your father's experience. He was so well educated, but could not succeed. And were you ever able to place doctors that were trained elsewhere with your business? Trained
elsewhere? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Oh, I beg your pardon. So you were mentioning, I have a friend who's a doctor from Ukraine, and she has not ever been able to work in that field, so she works in helping people to test drugs and that
no,
kind of thing.
The people I brought in from Ukraine are not physicians. I'm just talking generally, that there's 100,000
yes.
physicians. My dad, I think, motivated me certainly towards academia.
Yeah.
Frankly, you know, both parents being Jewish, they wanted me to be a doctor, but I can't stand the sight of blood, so that didn't work out. So it shifted me. When I first started at Pitt, my degree was in psychology, Bachelor of Science in Psychology, but I didn't like that because when I went to Pitt, all of psychology was rat psychology. It was behaviorism, which, you know, rat mazes and all that. And I said, oh, geez, that's not my thing. So that shifted me towards people and sociology. And, but I have to say, knowing that my father was a PhD in economics, academics made a whole lot of sense for me, and that's what I did.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Dan, thank you very much. I think we've, yeah, let's give him a round of applause. Good audience. Yeah, absolutely. And so thank you all for being here. Thank you for your attention and questions. We had a nice discussion, I thought. And Dan, thank you for the plug for sociology. I appreciated that. You students who are here, think about majoring in sociology. There's no better field that you could study. Well, that was great. That was a lot of fun. And so we're going to have about a 20 or 25-minute break, and then we'll continue up in this wonderful room of A408, which I only discovered yesterday for the first time. We had a session there, and Jess, you were there. And so what A408 allows us to do is have people in the room and people also joining us online, and we can speak to each other. So we're going to be learning about this incredible organization in Pittsburgh called Classrooms Without Borders. Kate is here with us to talk about it, and it's an organization that supports teachers to study in Europe at the Holocaust-related sites. So there's a lot of good information, and I hope that some of you will take advantage of this program. So hopefully I'll see you upstairs, and also don't forget this evening, 7 p.m., we have a wonderful lecture planned with Dr. Patetti on Native American history and literature. So I hope to see you then. Thank you.